This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
He mentioned the castle, did he? Yeah. About the value, about the improvements and the wrought iron, without genuine fake. He didn't play it. Oh, they should grab it. That would be brilliant.
There's another the pork butter. Yeah, probably pork.
Because it's great when the valuer comes out. I'm here to do the valuation. And that whole scene where he's looking at the chicken coop, you've got to do it. No, don't do it. Adds value to the place. There's a video. Well, so you need to get that grab, I reckon, that value, when he points out all the things are assets, or improvements are actually detrimental to the value of the place. The fake wrought iron, and the fake chimney. He said, oh, see that chimney? And he goes, yep, yes, mate. Adds value to the place.
Okay.
All right, whenever you're ready.
I'll probably just show you the two parts.
Okay, I'll grab my
All right. So it's major decline of the number of students. All right. So okay. Tonight's topic is on plant and machineries and infrastructure. So we have our very good friends, Rob and Ray, who has been valuing probably hundreds of plant equipment and infrastructure projects, both locally and internationally. So I would like Rob to give a bit of sort of self-introduction at the beginning, because I don't think I can fully remember all his extensive experience across the world. So.
Thanks, Hal. Hello, everyone. We good? Yes? Have you got another session after this one? Hal? Is he gone? God, don't. Geez, that didn't last long. He's seen this about 4 times, so he's probably it's growing, but it's still getting very interesting. So, how many of you guys have heard of plant and machinery as a valuation discipline? Many? Few of you have. So, when people ask me what do you do for a job, I always say I'm a valuer, and the next question is, oh, a property valuer. And I say, no, I'm a valuer of assets and plant and machinery. Oh, what's that? And then you explain to them what that is. And tonight, hopefully, from my presentation, you'll get a great understanding of what that is. But when you think of valuers, not only is it property that gets valued, but there's also assets, like what I'm talking about, that gets valued, but there's also businesses. So accountants value businesses when mergers and acquisitions and takeovers and tax situations, which I'll explain about. But there's also other specialties like gems and jewellery, fine arts, collectibles and collections of various kinds. I've even met people in the US who actually specialise in the valuation of Disneyana. All they value is stuff from Disneyland. So there are specialties around the world. There's not many of us in Australia who value plant and machinery. There's about 60 qualified with the Australian Property Institute. I think there's 6,500 property valuers qualified with the Australian Property Institute. So as I'll highlight throughout my presentation, I get to travel a bit, which is quite nice. So just going through a bit of what it's going to look like. So I'll just introduce the topic in a bit more detail, what the drivers are for valuation. So we all understand, we're doing the Masters of Property course, so we understand about property valuation. The same principles apply regardless of the asset you're valuing. The cost, market and income approach for plant and machinery is the same for cost, market and income for property. And I'll explain what the drivers are. So what are the market opportunities where valuations are required? Then I'll go into a very quick P&M valuation 101. How do we actually value plant and machinery at a very high level? And then valuation project examples. So to highlight, it's not just valuing factories and forklift trucks and machine tools in engineering works, which is quite often a misnomer. about valuers and what they do. A lot of plant and equipment valuers and auctioneers, so you might come from the auctioneering fraternity, but there are others like myself who come from the accounting and finance and property side. When to engage a valuer, I grabbed a couple of slides from a presentation I did at the Albury-Wodonga Australian Property Institute conference to a group of valuers, and just highlighted some properties that might require, or some assets that might require a specialist valuer, and some case studies that I've done of some interesting projects, and just a little slide on networking. Excuse me, and I've got my vodka here if anyone wants some. I think Hal saw the bottle and he nearly had a heart attack, so but it is just water, unfortunately. So according to, there's a few valuations, and plant and equipment is described in a number of places. So the Victorian Government describes as a specialty property guideline in relation to plant and equipment. The slides will be available if you want them, so don't go nuts taking notes, but you can find them, or you can email me and I can steer you in the right direction for these things. So it talks about aged care facilities, development land, golf courses, etc., and of course there's a section there, quite a large section on plant and equipment. The government owns a lot of plant and equipment, and when you think about what they own railway tracks, they own train stations, they own hospitals, they used to own electricity infrastructure, generation, transmission and distribution. They own water infrastructure still in Australia and Victoria. They used to own gas infrastructure, but they don't own that anymore. There used to be a government body called the Gas and Fuel. The Melbourne Water is still a government body, and all the various country water authorities still own the water infrastructure, but electricity has been privatised over the years. But there's still a lot of assets that need to be valued, and the Valuer General has a 5-year program of when they get valued, and they advertise that, and they have a valuation panel to do that. And as I said, it's a whole lot of things, from fire stations, police stations, hospitals, etc. And the plant, they even own the assets at the Grand Prix. They even own the speed cameras over the CityLink tollway and Eastlink. They own the speed cameras. They own all sorts of things, and they all get valued regularly, and that's the area in which I operate. That's a guideline, specialist property guidelines for plant and equipment, published by the government. Internationally, there are, as a valuer, I'm a member of RICS and a member of the Australian Property Institute, so there are valuation standards, international valuation standards published by RICS and the IVSC, the International Valuation Standards, also promoted by the API and RICS. And they all emanate from the international valuation standards, so London through RICS, Australia through API, all localise those international standards, if you like. I won't go through them, I'll just highlight a couple that are relevant, and they Australianise them, but they're essentially the same. And the Australian accounting standard, a lot of the valuations we do are for government purposes, government compliance purposes, such as, so the Australian Accounting Standard Board, AASB 116, relates to how you should value property, plant and equipment, and the premise of fair value measurement under AASB 13, and AASB 136 is the impairment of assets, so to make sure they're not overvalued. That's a short description of that standard. So the regulatory environment for valuations tends to follow the accounting standards. So it's fairly consistent internationally, even more so as countries around the world either adopt international accounting standards or implement local ones that replicate them more or less. Valuation standards, mostly local, mostly market related, also abound in the tax law, corporate law, government policy, insurance law, etc. So you can see the definition of market value described differently in so many areas, but essentially they all mean the same thing. In Australia, qualified valuers get their qualifications through the Australian Property Institute, RICS and the American Society of Appraisers. So they're the three major bodies that look after people such as myself, and property valuers. They're actually, the API and the ASA are starting to talk to each other about some training courses offered by one party, professional insurance professional indemnity insurance offered by another, and the API and the ASA talking along those lines. I've already asked you these questions. Does anyone know a P&M value, or you all do? You all know me now. Do you know what I do? I've just told you. Do you know how many qualified valuers there are? I told you that too, but I'm not testing you on that. And one interesting question that the next slide's very interesting. A couple of years ago, I haven't updated it, but the relationship would still be the same. I got one of my staff to look at what was the relationship between the property values and the asset values of the ASX top 10 companies. So in other words, how much of the ASX top 10, how much of their assets was property and how much was everything else? Now, interesting at the time, there are the top 10 companies, they're all miners or bankers pretty much, and some retailers. So their property value was worth 31 billion. But the value of everything else that they had, tangible assets, was 252 billion. You might think, how is that so? So when you think about someone like BHP Billiton, they don't have a lot of property. Well, they have a lot of property. They have $12 billion worth of property. But they also have $121 billion worth of other assets. So that's mining assets, mining tenements, it's mining licences, mining development, and hard assets that can depreciate. And so as you can see, the relationship there between plant and equipment and property is quite different. It's 31 million to 252 billion. 31 billion to 252 billion. So P&E, or plant and equipment, has a fairly serious place in the world of shares and equities and business. So in the next hour or so, I've described to you a high-level sort of intro to the regulatory government environment and the standards that apply, the qualifications of plant and equipment valuers, the drivers, and some examples and some case studies. So now that more people are here, probably a good time to sort of just chill out a little bit. And I'm going to give you a bit of a mental exercise. You have to pay attention. If you're going to pay attention for 5 minutes, this is the 5 minutes. So understanding what the client wants is an important part of the valuation process. So even though they ask you they want a market valuation for X, Y, Z, but if you know that it's not actually X, Y, Z, it's A, B, C that they want, it could be they want you to do a market valuation because behind closed doors they're doing a merger. And a different basis of valuation might be required for that purpose as opposed to the one that they got you in for. So if the client simply wants a valuation number on which to insure their assets, for example, as opposed to a detailed inventory to upload and update their fixed asset register, different approaches need to be taken. So often as valuers, we're intuitive and have a fair expectation of where valuers are likely to end up at the end of the project. So this is more so as we get older and you get years of experience under the belt. So in my experience, I can walk into a factory or a manufacturing plant, and I often get asked, what do you think we're worth? Straight away. And I'll ask them for how much are you insured for? And then I can do a quick depreciation calculation in my head and give them a ballpark straight away. And 9 times out of 10, I'm pretty right. So the report I know that's the answer or thereabouts. So I've got to spend the next days or weeks or sometimes months investigating and writing a report that's probably going to tell me something not too far from what I guessed in about 10 minutes. So the report needs to provide a narrative of what my impressions are, the observations, the knowledge, research and findings. The report needs to take the reader, who is normally the CFO or the CEO or the business owner, on a journey on how the valuation results were arrived at. So to illustrate the power of the report, I've got a simple mathematical test for you. So I want you all to think of a number, and this is the 2 minutes. Someone knows, some of you are smiling and you might know the answer to this. So I want you all to think of a number between 1 and 10. You can write it down if you like, but think of a number between 1 and 10. I want you to double it. Add 10. Halve that number. So I want you now minus the number you first thought of when I asked you to think of a number between 1 and 10. Minus 1. So you've now got a number. Have you all got a number in your mind? Pretty much. This is why it's important to listen. So now I'm going to turn that number into a letter. If it's 1, it's A. If it's B, it's C. If it's 2, it's B. If it's 3, it's C. If it's 4, it's D. So now I want you to convert your number to A, B, C or D. Are you with me? Do I need to go back? Right, now I want you to think of a country that begins with that letter. Now you're in that country and you're at the zoo and you're walking around and you're going to a large enclosure and there's a big animal with big ears. What colour is that animal? Don't answer. And what country are you in as well? So after careful application of the above instructions, which is like a valuer narrating his report on his research and findings, the colour of that animal in that zoo, in that country, should be a grey elephant in Denmark. So did you get a grey elephant in Denmark? Did anyone get a grey elephant in Denmark? You did. Right, you're a valuer. So I can show you that again, just so to prove it's right. Let's just pick any number. Let's pick 6. Double it, 12. Add 10. 26. Divide by 2. 13. Minus the number you first thought of when I said think of a number. So 13 minus 6 is 5. Minus 1 is 4. A, B, C, D. We end up with D every time. D, think of a country that begins with D. Some people go Deutschland to try and be clever. But 9 times out of 10, most people will pick Denmark. And then you've got the elephant and you've got the zoo. So the narrative of the report has to be, well, whilst that was complicated, has to steer the reader where you want that reader to go, especially on expert witness reports. And I can share you some of those examples that I've done in the past on expert witness projects. So this is a light example of mathematics telling a story. It's essential the story that a valuation report needs to take in valuing specialised assets. So that story, the ingredients in that story are replacement cost, an optimised replacement cost, I'll explain what they are in a minute, effective life and residual value, depreciation type, depreciated replacement cost. When the above story is told in the report, the asset schedules and data need not be explained further, as the reader will fully be aware of what you're telling them. So every day we do things as valuers that require valuation skills. We're all valuers, we just do it in varying degrees. So here are some daily situations where we use valuation basics to consider the price of things in our daily life. So if we're online and we're looking at holidays or flights and we're comparing prices, or we go to Webjet or Flight Centre or Trivago or Last Minute or any of those websites and look at the cost of going from A to B, we actually use valuation skills to perceive what is value for money and whether to buy a ticket or a holiday, etc., or not, and when to go. If you looked at this website and searched the value of a car, so if you've got a car or you're buying a car or someone says my car's for sale, do you want to buy it? You jump on a site like this and you actually do a bit of research and think that's a good price, or he's got rocks in his head. So you make those assumptions as you go along, but you are actually, whether you know it or not, you actually are employing valuation skills and using the market approach in doing so. Domain is another example of where you might be looking at renting a house or an apartment or buying property as well, and using those valuation skills in making that judgment. And of course eBay, buying and selling things. The Trading Post is another forum. It used to be a newspaper in Melbourne, in Australia, and people used to buy and sell things in the Trading Post and actually buy the newspaper, but now it's online. So some of us are all valuers. Now you may not have heard of this movie, but this movie is called The Castle, and you may have seen it, but there's some very interesting valuation discussions in the movie.
Steve is an apprentice mechanic, but he spends most of his time reading the Trading Post. He just loves buying and trading.
Ergonomic chairs. Boring. What do you want? 180. Drink.
Dad, 450.
But Jousting stick. Telling me. Green.
How much is a jousting stick worth, Dad?
I couldn't be more than 250. And on addition.
Dad, some guy's selling an overhead projector.
Nah.
Now hang on, Steve. What's he asking?
1
what's a pulpit where the minister gives his sermon from? How much?
800.
Dreaming.
So as you can see, we're all valuers in varying degrees, and it's a very. I was speaking with Hal earlier. There's another scene from that movie where the valuer actually goes around to value the house, and he points out all the what he thinks are the attributes of the house, like the fake chimney and the fake wrought iron, and how it supposedly would add value, but clearly it doesn't. So of course my mother said I should always go on this show because I know how much a 500 litre fridge freezer is. So it's actually quite interesting. It's scary how much I know the prices of things and remember things. So putting your inner Daryl Kerrigan, who is the son in that movie, your inner Daryl Kerrigan to the test. There's two things here that I just want to highlight. So not everything depreciates in the plant and equipment world. Some things appreciate, like this thing. So this thing is a Ford Falcon GTHO, an Australian, what you'd call a supercar or muscle car, built in 1970. There was only 200 built to qualify for a race in Bathurst. And the original price in 1970 was $5,700. 1970, so it's 49 years ago. So it's nearly a 50-year-old car, nearly a classic. Well, it is a classic, but there was only 200 built. There's not that many around anymore. Anyone care to guess what that car's worth today? How much? $1 million. Nearly $1 million. 800. 800,000, and that was my parents' family car from 1970 to 1985. So if Dad had it today, he would be very excited. So do things like that. It's not exactly the family car. It's a family car just like it, but the registration, it's so close, the same colour and everything. That number plate is KJS 557, and our number plate was KOS. And we used to call it Chaos, of course. So this is another project that I worked on. It was a mining, 2 mines in Western Australia. In 2007, the 2 mines cost $3.1 billion to build. What are they? And we valued them, I think it was 2013 or 14. And would you care to guess what value we put on those mines? And that, mind you, that at the time they were only 7 years old, 6 or 7 years old. It's like, no, you'll never guess it, so I'll just keep going. So, estimated value, that's a year ago, but it's probably not too dissimilar today. Why? So Xstrata bought the mine. It was built in 2007 for $3.1 billion as nickel reached its historic price and created a bidding war for nickel. At the same time, BHP spent $6 billion opening a mine next door. One thing led to another, and it eventually sold for, one mine sold for $24.5 million and the other for $30 million. So in that valuation, that was really interesting because we had all these big numbers, and the mine development, so digging and digging and digging, it got so expensive, and the value of what they were getting out of the ground had become so cheap, and the US dollar exchange rate, all of this perfect storm meant it was not financially viable anymore, so they just stopped. One, they filled with water and made into a lake, excuse me, which is rather impressive. And the other one, they just sort of stopped and put in what they call care and maintenance and wait for things to change. And they wait for things to change, like the exchange rate, and they wait for the nickel price to go up. And you know what? They went up. So the Australian dollar was at 80 cents at the time. They said they needed to go to 60-something cents for it to be viable. The nickel price had to double. All those things happened, and those mines become viable again. And that's quite common as mines get deeper and deeper. So what drives a valuation? So why do people need valuations? So like the valuation of property, plant machinery is required for many reasons. The most common are for insurance purposes. So people want to know how much should they insure all the assets in their business. So whether it's the, well, buildings, typically property valuers value those, but we as plant valuers may value tenants' improvements. So if they lease the property and they improve them, we'll value them. For insurance and for other reasons, but generally speaking, most assets that aren't property are valued by tangible assets. There are intangible assets that the accountants do. I won't get into those right now, but so the insurance purpose is a main reason. Mergers and acquisitions is one of the other major reasons. So with M&A, the big factor in the valuation is what will help our client if they are on the buy side. So if they're bidding for an asset, so they can look at, or a business, so they can look at the pre and post-tax benefits associated with acquiring that business and the assets it's got. Minimising goodwill. So when you buy a business, you'll pay X amount of dollars for the shares, or you'll pay a multiple of net profit, or a multiple of gross revenue, etc., to actually come up with a value of that business. And you inherit those assets. So when you inherit those assets, you've effectively acquired those assets, and the tax office will let you revalue those assets at market value, not simply adopt the written down value for tax that the vendor has in their books. You have an opportunity to allocate some of the purchase price using market value principles to those assets, and thereby reducing the value of goodwill. So goodwill is not a deductible in Australia, so you can't depreciate it. So the higher the value of the assets in a transaction, the better it is for the client. So I've got one client at the moment, they're in the retail food chain business. A private equity firm bought them for nearly 60 million. The book value of the assets is 14 million. So if I come in and so at the moment, so if it's 14 million, they don't change anything. Let's assuming at 10% per annum, they're getting $1.4 million tax deduction every year off their income tax and their tax return. But if I come in and value those assets at 40 million, they'd be getting $4 million off per annum for the life of the asset. So it's 2.6 million more year one, 2.6 million more year 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's the benefit of doing that. Due diligence pre and post, so we actually check that what they are buying actually physically exists. So that's another reason. Establishing those opening book and tax values for fair value reporting and tax depreciation, and stamp duty purposes. So each state has different stamp duty legislations. And there's actually, I had a call about one today actually, which is very interesting, and I'll bring that back up a bit later on when I'm telling you what I'm doing this year. So where do we get these requests? How do they come in the door? So things happen. So I just looked online today on investordaily.com.au and news.com.au, and I found 4 things. So the CBA, Japanese bank Mitsubishi UFJ Trust and Banking Corporation, MUTB, completed an acquisition of Colonial First State Global Asset Management from the CBA for $4.2 billion. There is valuations involved in that. Vic Super, First State Super, following the completed merger of 2 major Queensland super funds, Vic Super and First State have entered into discussions for consolidating with the potential to become Australia's second largest super fund behind Australian Super. There are valuations behind that. Incitec Pivot, so that's a fertiliser manufacturer, a company that also owns a company called Dyno Nobel that makes explosives for the mine industry. They complement each other, those services, has downgraded its full-year earnings guidance and announced a review of its local fertilisers division. So whilst not exactly a valuation, but there is a valuation opportunity around the corner if they do a restructure, if they sell off a less than desirable business unit. And Shell, a $617 million takeover offer for ASX-listed ERM Power. That's a portable power company, I think, from memory. I didn't look them up because I thought I knew who they were. I think they provide emergency power supplies to companies if they go offline and have all their assets upgraded and they need to take their generators and their power services offline to repair and maintain. ERM come in and provide that power. So opportunities exist everywhere from the smallest single asset appraisal costing it can be a few $100s, to the largest multinational projects costing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in valuation fees, and I've worked on them all. So for tax, I mentioned before, so purchase price allocating that purchase price. Stamp duty, minimising stamp duty is one of the reasons we're engaged as valuers. So the client I was mentioning before, I had a call today about it, is the stamp duty legislation has actually identified that fixtures are fixed to the land and they become so affixed that they become, so chattels are fixed to the land, they become a fixture. can be looked at separately from the land, because normally you would say, well, if we were valuing these chairs in this room, we would look at what's the lease on this property. If the lease is only got 5 years to remain, but the furniture had a 10-year remaining life, well, the furniture can only be depreciated over the remaining life of the lease because it will have nowhere to live. So that's one of the drivers that we're looking at, and we're actually saying, well, if it's custom made and built and fit for purpose for this room, and it's actually been asked to value it separate to the lease, is it actually worth anything at all? So that's the dilemma that we were on the phone about for an hour today with a group of people. Thin capitalisation, I can't really remember what that is, but I think it's, I haven't spoken about it for a long time, but it's in relation to your debt and your holding value of your assets versus your debt equation. One way to actually meet what we call thin cap rules is to actually have a higher value for your assets to meet threshold tests for the regulators. Capital gains tax, income tax returns, disputes and audits. So that's the tax arena, if you like, for driving valuation requests. Purchase price accounting. So this is the accounting side. So minimising goodwill, as I mentioned, because it's not a deduction and it's only a cost of business. Opening book and tax values, as I mentioned before. Future depreciation costs for running your depreciation for your business. Inputs for the discounted cash flow model and financial planning. And inputs for the ACA, which is the allocating of the, it's called the allocable cost approach in allocating the purchase price. So fair value reporting, that's the regulated reporting that companies can either value on the basis of fair value or cost, less depreciation under the accounting standards. Most people have adopted fair value by now, so that means they're reporting market value and looking at the various approaches to market value, whether it's the market comparison approach, the income approach and the cost approach, optimisation and obsolescence, so, and I'll explain a bit about those a bit later. Market-based lending, so guarantees for banks and leasing companies, etc. And liquidating, in the event of a default and a receivership, liquidating those assets and what you could get for them. Insurance, reinstatement insurance value, indemnity, which is not only the cost of a new asset but the cost of all the fees, professional fees, cost escalation during the insurance period. So an asset might cost $10,000, but the insurance policy is 1 year, has a life of 1 year. So could that asset be $10.5 or $11 million at any time in that 12-month period? So that's the number we look at for insurance purposes. Indemnity value is if they do not replace the asset, but they will take a cash settlement in lieu of that asset. For example, it might not be able to be replaced, or they're looking at ways of reducing their premium. Market value, I think we've got to understand the premise of market value. Removal of debris, so what it would cost to get a site ready to rebuild when they've had a loss. The post-loss claim, so we can help them with those. And expert witness if there's an expert witness matter in relation to insurance. Restructuring, so voluntary administration, going concern valuations, market value, existing use, receiverships and liquidations. And a real big area that's really starting to increase is expert witness and litigation support. I think Australia's becoming more litigious just because we're getting bigger and people are stuffing up a bit more. So I've been asked to do a lot of reports as an expert witness in the Supreme Court, arbitrations, quantum hearings, so looking at the numbers, not the fault, but the numbers, and ATO and State Revenue Office audits as well, where there's a dispute. And other drivers such as asset management, fixed asset register management and overhauls, third-party reviews, auditor support, effective life reviews for depreciation, etc., etc. So that's trying to get all the boring bits out pretty quickly. So as valuers, as I mentioned before, we have the three approaches to value, whether we're valuing a chair in this auditorium or an overhead projector. If none of you knew what an overhead projector was, when it was mentioned in the video, that's an overhead projector. Probably doesn't get used very much, but that's what an overhead projector is. And they've been around a long time. So we use the market, the income and the cost approach. So the market approach is, by definition, seeks to determine the current value of an asset by reference to comparable transactions involving the sale of similar assets. That's not definition, that's what it does. I won't get into the definitions and get too technical. So we try and benchmark known property evidence with what it is that we're valuing, and it might be on a dollar per square metre basis, dollar per deadweight tonne, if it's a ship, dollar per 20-foot equivalent unit, if it's a certain type of ship, dollar per tonne per annum in manufacturing capacity, dollar per metres cube in storage capacity, etc., etc. We benchmark what we're valuing with what's out there in the marketplace. We look at direct comparisons with what's offered in the market. We also look at rental rates. So sometimes the charter rate for a ship or the rental rate for a container, a shipping container, or another item like a forklift truck or a rental car might be another means of determining the market value. And we also look at what things cost new to build as well. So sometimes we actually get asked by banks what's something worth, and it's brand new. So, which is quite silly because you sort of think, well, it's brand new, that's what it's worth. But then you might think, well, what are all the other costs associated with an asset? So a ship, for example, they might advertise, a shipyard might build something for $50 million, but that's what the shipyard is, only a small cog, it's actually a pretty big cog, in the process of building a ship. So there's also the naval architect, there's design fees, there's interest during construction, there's project management of the build, there's owner's costs in actually getting to market, and if they can capture all of those costs, then they can form part of the day one value that can be financed. So nearly always used as the primary approach when an active and liquid market exists and sufficient market evidence and data is available. However, that's rarely the case except for generic, movable and adaptive assets. So when by that I mean assets that trade regularly in the marketplace. So the income approach seeks to determine the present value of anticipated economic benefits associated with an asset. I won't go into the rest of it, but it's typically plant valuers steer away from this. Often when you're working in conjunction with other valuers, somebody has done an assessment of the value of the business using an income approach. So to do it again, you would actually, by default, include a few things. You probably end up valuing the business by default. You're also valuing goodwill by default, and you don't want to do that when it comes to tangible assets. You can't depreciate goodwill, and by using an income approach, there is an implied, it is implied, and it's actually mentioned specifically that it's implied by the tax office that you are valuing goodwill using this approach, so they won't allow it for you to claim your tax depreciation. So I won't go on about that, but the slide's there. And the cost approach, which is probably the meat and potatoes, the bread and butter of plant equipment and infrastructure valuers, which the depreciated replacement cost approach involves establishing the new price, so the gross current replacement cost, then depreciating these costs to reflect the anticipated effective working life of the assets from new over their respective ages, taking into account their residual value, if any, and all relevant forms of obsolescence, so things that impact on the value, and optimisation. So generally used when market evidence is too few or non-existent, or it's a specialised asset and no market exists. So the key considerations in doing that are the gross current replacement cost, new price, or optimised replacement cost. So the difference being gross current replacement cost is like for like. So in other words, if you've got a printing press and you can phone the manufacturer and get an identical printing press, that's the printing press you'll end up valuing or using as a replacement cost for the asset you're valuing. If it doesn't exist and a newer one that's faster, it's more expensive, it's super duper, well, you might have to discount that price somewhat because you would have to optimise that replacement cost. And I've got an example of optimised replacement costs on a mining asset a bit later on. Useful life, so how long the asset will last before it needs to be retired, and that's retired at the end of its life, not if it's going to be sold and then sold to a third party, but the end of its life for valuation purposes. How old is it? So its age, its remaining life, and its residual value if there's anything left over at the end. So could you scrap it or salvage it, or is there a liability at the end? So a cost of clean-up, for example, if it's a boiler or if it's a power station or an asset that needs to be removed. Depreciation. So it's the actual loss in value from physical deterioration, wear and tear. Obsolescence. So there are a few forms of obsolescence. Functional obsolescence. Factors inherent in the asset itself, so size, capacity, performance. And economic obsolescence. Factors inherent in the limitations of the business or the industry in which it operates. So economic obsolescence might be a change in government legislation that makes that plant or that asset obsolete. It might be a change in environmental regulations that means that asset has to be upgraded before it can be continued to be used after a certain date. It could also be the fact that the business is not trading profitably at all, and the value that you're going to put on the asset needs to be mindful of that, because you are the company can't sustain the value that you're going to put on the asset. So that's a form of economic obsolescence through management. So in a perfect market, market value equals gross current replacement cost, so new price minus depreciation. In a perfect world, it doesn't always not always like that, but that's if I got up every day and that happened, I'd be pretty happy. There are two main types of depreciation: straight line, so constant, even, periodic depreciation. So something's got a 10-year life, 10% of the value is being removed every year of its life. If it's got a diminishing value or accelerated depreciation, that reduction is exponential. So more at the beginning of the life, and it slows down midway and then slows down to virtually nil towards the end to arrive at the residual value. So just graphically I can show you what that means. So on the left is straight line, equal instalment reductions, so it's a 10-year life down to a whatever residual I said, 5% residual. So if something's older than that, you would report residual value multiplied by the replacement cost equals the value of that asset. And diminishing value does the same, but one's more accelerated. So I think we're saying at year 5, to compare the two approaches, at year 5, the diminishing value approach would give you 22.4%, whereas the straight line depreciation would give you about 50%. If it was a zero, went to zero, not to 5%, it should be less, be a little bit more than zero. So, I've got through all the mundane bits, so the exciting bits. So this is some of the exciting things I've valued over the years, and just to give you an example of the breadth of projects I've worked on and what plant and equipment value has worked on. So I've got a mate who posts on LinkedIn a day in the life of a valuer, and it's 1 minute he's valuing Lamborghinis, and next minute he's valuing an aeroplane in country Australia somewhere, and all over the place. I'd love to do the same, but he's already doing it, so I can't do it. So I just keep liking everything he does. So, but some of the things I've done. So I valued a fleet of vessels, livestock vessels in the Middle East and Asia. So there was 9 of them. So I got to go to some pretty interesting countries like Jordan and Oman and Doha, Singapore, Dubai, and Lebanon in that process. Very interesting. Metro Tasmania. I value the bus fleet for the government in Tasmania every 3 years, and I've just done it again. So that's 21 years I've actually been valuing that fleet of buses. So it's a nice little job every 3 years to go down there. I've just valued a whole stack of bulk fuel terminals. So when you go at the docks where all the shipping container cranes are, you'll see a whole lot of tanks for fuel. So it's a business that owns a lot of those. I've just done one of those again this year. Xstrata by Glencore Mining. So Glencore from Switzerland bought Xstrata Mining globally, and in 2014 I was in charge of valuing 100 mines in 20 countries. So I had valuers running off all over the place. That same company there bought in 2013 Viterra, a big grain company out of Canada. There's also got a lot of grain assets in South Australia. And the proposed acquisition by GrainCorp of Archer Daniels Midland. So I got to go to Illinois in the US to do a pitch to Archer Daniels Midland to say, if you're going to go and buy this business in Australia, you should use, I was with PwC at the time, use us to do the valuations. We won the work. It's about a $7 million fee, and then the Australian Foreign Investment Review Board killed the deal, said no, it's not in the interests of the country if that happens. So we spent a lot of money doing it, But we won the work, but it didn't go ahead, unfortunately. I valued an oil refinery in Vietnam for the Russian government, strangely enough. How's that one? That's so weird. A Takata seatbelt and airbag manufacturing plant. So in 2015, when the first airbags were a problem, started to, well, that was a bit before that, but if you've heard about the airbag issue with all the cars that are going off around the world, I think 20 people have been killed and lots of cars are being recalled. The bailout package by the Japanese government was done because part of that process, they said, oh, how much are their assets of the company worth? So we had to go and value all their assets at 18 plants around the world. So I took North America, I sent people to Europe, and I sent people to Asia to do that. And I'll come back to this one because that's not over. Investigative report on the depreciation policies of Victorian Health. That was a really, really interesting project. The Victorian government couldn't work out why their depreciation charges were $800 million on $10 billion worth of assets, whereas the New South Wales and Queensland, who also had $10 billion worth of assets, their depreciation charges were only $400 million. And so we looked at it, and they're in 22 or 23 hospitals, and it took 2 or 3 weeks to find out, but eventually we did find out the revaluation program that the Victorian government had put in place had been done incorrectly. And what had happened is they instructed valuers, contract valuers, to go out and, buildings have a 40-year life. And so one valuer went out to a hospital and said, how old is this building? And the building was 106 years old. And they said, oh, okay, so how long are you going to use it for? And they said, we're going to use it for 10 more years, but then we're going to demolish it because these are our plans. So the depreciation they used, they grossed up the number, and then the depreciation rate they used was 10 over 40 was the multiplication factor. So what they should, and it was valued at 25% of the replacement cost. So what they should have done was, the remaining useful life is 10, but it should have been over, its age is 106, and it's going to be around for another 10 more years, it's 116, so it should have been 10 over 116, not 10 over 40. So they actually tripled the value of that product, that each building asset when that happened. So that was really interesting. We told them you can wait for the next revaluation cycle and fix it, or you can fix it now. But yeah, there was some interesting discussions, as you can imagine. A bit closer to now, a couple of other projects valuing Ingham's Chicken. So the owner of Ingham's Chicken sold it to his business to private equity, and he said, if the stamp duty is more than 25 million, I'll pay the difference. So it was a big discussion and big exercise to actually work out how much stamp duty he was paying around the country. And it actually was a little bit more than 25 million. I valued a cruise ship in Fiji for what was going to be, it hasn't happened, but the guys who were going to buy it were going to convert it to a university on behalf of the University of Stanford. They're going to call it the Entrepreneurship. The first of its kind, floating, having semesters in entrepreneurial studies around the Pacific and Asia. A great idea, but it didn't happen. It was the wrong vessel. And other projects, the Port of Gladstone, the Port of Melbourne, valuing it. You may or may not remember the Port of Melbourne actually got leased for 50 years to a consortium, and on a sale and leaseback arrangement. And I was involved in reviewing the valuation of the channel. So interestingly enough, when I got the valuation by one of my guys in PwC in a different area, in the modelling team, he said, I've built up the model, what do you think? I said, it's wrong. And he said, why is it wrong? I said, you've depreciated a $5 billion asset and you don't depreciate it. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's a channel is just a hole in the sand, and if you stop maintaining it, it disappears in months. So it's actually a perpetual asset. There's a cost to build it, and then the cost of actually maintaining it is expense and expense and expense, but the asset is still the same asset that was there the day they finished building it. So you don't depreciate it. So it's not a depreciating asset. They shouldn't depreciate it in the books. They shouldn't depreciate it in the financials. It's just it's a capital asset that they have to maintain. So in perpetuity. Otherwise, you can't bring the big ships into Melbourne. So if they say the depth of the channel is 23 metres, and you go and buy it, and you value it based on a 23-metre channel, and you pay for it, and then they come along and survey it and say, oh, it's only 18 metres. So there's a big argument, and there was, about actually what they paid for the channel. I've valued a whole stack of abattoirs and meat processing facilities around Australia in an acquisition. The last 3 or 4 years, I've valued Allianz's IT infrastructure at their disaster and there was a disaster recovery centre, I can't remember the name of the other one, but 2 major computer centres in Sydney. There was a sawmill in country Victoria that the government was going to effectively shut down because of a spotted owl or some equally I can't remember what it was, but it was some animal that they found in one part of this forest, and they said, we're closing the whole thing down, and this mill had been there for 40 years, was going to shut down. Anyway, they offered a settlement, and it was like a tenth of what they should have been paid. So anyway, it ended up being that the Victorian government ended up buying it and continuing to operate it with and looking after all the wildlife. So an interesting project too was valuing all of the yellow plastic sharps containers for a company. No, I didn't have to go and look at them or open them or anything like that. See a few faces scrunching up. But it was a large restructuring project for a company in Australia it's called Daniels Healthcare, and I'll just remember their name, Daniels Healthcare, and they own these things all around the world, and they rent them. So these businesses that rent assets, whether they're forklift trucks or containers, sharps containers in hospitals and medical facilities around the world, portable buildings, they make a fortune. Absolute fortune. Even IT and audio-visual equipment that gets rented, these businesses make a lot of money. So this company was no exception. A carrot processing plant in country Victoria. Who would have thought going to Mildura and looking at this agricultural land would install $10 million to upgrade one of their sheds? This is just an upgrade. It was already 5 times bigger than this, but this is just an upgrade in the carrot capital of Australia. And I've got a client in Shepparton, Victoria, that's actually buying a whole stack of concrete product plants around New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia. So this year I've now moved out in my own business since July last year. So this financial year I've valued, in the process of I've valued, and now I'm in the process of selling some large-scale scaffolding and formwork company. They're moving out of that part of their business. They're a builder, but they have these assets and they want to get out of that side of it. I've got a picture later on of 3 concrete railway sleeper manufacturing plants that a German company bought off Lang O'Rourke, a large construction company in Australia. So Lang O'Rourke had a rail division and they built concrete sleepers to support largely the mining industry. There's a gas plant in Port Campbell that was built 20 years ago in Victoria. 20 years ago we had a large explosion at the gas plant down at Longford in Gippsland. And it meant no one had any gas for quite some time. It was funny, everyone was showering with eskies and in cold water. In Melbourne, we all had just, hair was all a mess. Like the end of the world, because you didn't have any hot water. So they built this plant in a hurry, and it's there. So I did, and that's why it was built there, to guarantee gas supplies into Victoria, and I did their insurance valuation a few months ago. And I mentioned before some portside bulk liquid storage terminals that I did a few years back, but I've just done another business now. An abattoir in Mildura, another one. An ice cream manufacturing plant for private equity firm. Numerous holiday and caravan parks. So my name's been given to a property valuer who specialises in this space. And it's a funny little thing. It's just, if you go as an operator of a caravan park or a pub, you have to buy the improvements that the landlord, off the landlord, and then when you vacate, when the lease ends, the landlord buys them back. So there's an in and an out cost. And so this family had been running this caravan park, and I've done a few, but the last one, and I had the call from them today, their fixed asset registers had a written down value of their assets for $14,000, because mum and dad, they didn't think to do anything. So they're thinking, we're out, the lease has not been renewed, we're 70 years of age, what are we going to do? So I said, okay, we need to value all your improvements. So I went around and valued all their improvements, and I said they were a couple of $100,000. And they got the call today from the landlord saying that he would agree to pay them. So they were in tears on the phone as I was driving here tonight, so it was really nice. A nice day in the office. And the Tasmanian Government bus fleet, again, that I mentioned before. So I've added that again in January. So what's on right now? So what's keeping me busy now? So I've actually mentioned their name, but I probably shouldn't have. So I can say this because it's in the public domain. So Sushi, we all love sushi. Who doesn't love sushi? So it was bought by private equity, and I mentioned before that gap between book value and purchase price. That's that example. I just came back 2 weeks ago from Newman in the middle of Western Australia to value a power station for Alinta. And the next 4 are very... So that's what's going on, that's what I've got to do, that's what I'm going to invoice. What I'm doing at the moment, been asked... I mentioned the Takata airbag recall before, so I've been asked, and I've mentioned this to Hal on email, but I've been asked to be an expert witness in the Takata airbag class actions in relation to how the vehicles would be valued fitted with a defective airbag. So if you as a customer went into a car yard and said, I want to buy a car, there's a car, and you and there's a price and you negotiate a price, and then the dealer says, oh, but it's one with a defective airbag. So are you going to fix it? Yes. But, and this is what they're not telling people, we're going to replace it with the same airbag that's in it. So what would happen, there's a stigma, I believe there is a stigma associated, if we were all told this, we would all think differently about buying that car or paying that price for that car. So, and that's my job, is to actually articulate that and formulate that as part of evidence. And that'd be a really, really interesting assignment. So fingers crossed that comes through in the next few days. And funnily enough, as I was telling my wife about this, an email popped up about a discussion I had a few months earlier, and I've been asked to be an expert to value 40 tugboats and barges in Indonesia for a London bank that funded these assets in Indonesia at the advice of a law firm, and everything went pear-shaped, and now the law firm's been sued. So you now know as much as I know, and so if you want a part-time job, come and see me. So my job is to value the tugboats, and I don't know any more about it other than that. But other than that, I've seen the email chain, and it looks like it's going to happen. So that'll mean a trip to Indonesia, for better or for worse, depending on where they are. So another project, a weird one, valuing the contents of the Hillsong Church. So Hillsong is a very modern church that sings and has a very large audio-visual and theatrical assets in their facilities. So quite a lot, not only Australia but overseas. So that's an interesting one that may get off the ground. And the last one, again, a phone call today, looks like it's going to go ahead. So it's a trucking business with depots in Ballarat and Geelong. It's a family law matter. So that's what's on for me right now, and keep me busy, which is good. So, which means, as I alluded to before, I get to travel. There's only 50 or 60 qualified valuers in Australia, so in the last 5 years, that's where I've been. So, on every state of it and territory of Australia, I'm trying to think if I've been to the Northern Territory. I think I have. So, internationally, I was very excited to do this. This actually takes a long time, I hope you realise and appreciate what I've done. But I have dragged it from year to year and added smileys. So there is, hang on, I think that's the last one. No, that's the last one, Florida. Bahamas. You probably think, Bahamas? I had to value 3 cruise ships in the Bahamas. So when people ask me what was your best job, getting on a plane, on business class, but using my points to upgrade to first class, because I can. And then the partners from the firm I was working at, and they were in the lounge and it was cup day, so there wasn't many people around, and we're talking away, and they had their 2 wives. What are you doing, Rob? I'm going to New York. Oh, we're going to New York. And as we're walking down, and I turned left, and they turned right. I said, And I said, oh, I've used my points to upgrade. I haven't got time for that. And I waved the ticket. I said, well, I think you should make time and read up on how you can upgrade. So, and flew over, landed at LA, and there was a singer in the lounge called Tony Bennett. I don't know if you've heard of Tony Bennett, an old crooner. So he was in the lounge, and I said to the guy, that's Tony Bennett. And he said, it's not. And I said, it is. And I went over to him and I asked him for his autograph. And we had a little chat, and I came over and I was like waving the boarding pass to him, and he said, look what you've done now. And I looked around, there was a line, like 20 people all lined up for autographs, like he was Father Christmas. So, again, travelling to all these places, I have seen and met interesting people. So I sat in London one time going to Greece. Everyone in the terminal was going nuts, and I thought, why is everyone getting all worked up? And then Sean Connery actually came and got on the plane, and he was sitting in 1B as we came around the corner, and I walked, and there he is, and I'm sitting like there, and he's there, and I just said, hi Sean, and he said, hi, how are you? And I said, good thanks, how's your golf? And he said, fine, thank you, fine. And so the whole 3 hours or 4 hours to Athens, everyone's going like all strangers are pointing and smiling, and you know, I've seen a few celebrities, but he's one where guys and girls absolutely just went weak at the knees. He's a superstar. So very exciting. I could entertain you for an hour on that subject alone. So just when's a good time to engage a valuer? So this was targeted at the property valuers in Albury because they refer work to valuers such as myself. So I was trying to instill to them when might be a good time to actually get someone like me involved. And I said, is it when you're valuing something like this? That might be a good idea, because I reckon they wouldn't know. And just so you can see in this photo, so all these are actually metal balls that are used in what's called a ball mill. So when rocks go into the ball mill, they just pulverise the ore into smaller and smaller sizes. So that's called the ball charge. So, and that's at the top of that ramp, and that's a processing plant there that they use chemicals, etc., to separate the minerals out of the ore. Or maybe something like this. So this was a milk distribution facility. There's one in Melbourne and one in Sydney for Murray Goulburn for their 10-year contract for providing milk to Coles. And they built this facility specifically. I think each facility has 30 million of, I think it's 15 million of plant and $15 million worth of buildings, and they were using it for mortgage purposes. And interesting, as a plant equipment valuer, I can look at an asset and do my depreciated replacement cost on specialty things like filling machines. But when a building or property valuer gets asked to value a property for mortgage purposes, they take the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is vacant possession. So even though it cost, I'm pretty sure it must have been, I think it was a $30 million building. Even a $30 million building and $30 million worth of plant. They said that on a worst case scenario, it's cold storage. That's only worth 5 million or 10 million, whatever it was. So it was a real struggle to get the valuers, the property valuers across the line to say to them, no, there's a contract for 10 years. Even if they don't pay, someone will come in and take over the contract. The facility's not going anywhere. So that was a really interesting project. Or maybe these. So whether it's the shipping containers on the wagons or the wagons underneath themselves. So these are everywhere. When you start looking for wagons, they're everywhere. They get rated. There's funny numbers on the side. It might say PKGY, and it might mean it's so long, it's 20 foot or 40 foot, it's got so many bogies, it's rated at a certain speed, it's a certain gauge. So there is a real, nomenclature is the word, but it's a real code in the rail industry as to what's what. And they are real interesting people to work with. Interesting good, not interesting strange, but interesting good. Salt of the earth. And they're always in, again, that was in the Wimmera, near Horsham somewhere. And that one was in Victoria. That one I can't remember. There's been a lot of them. Or how about this one? So this, I mentioned railway sleeper manufacturing facilities before with one of the M&A projects I did. So this company just those things up on the side of moulds. These are the sleepers, upside down, and their continuous lengths will go 150 metres down a shed, a purpose-built building, with the biggest saws you've ever seen cutting through the concrete and then lifting them up by crane and stacking them up. And they go and replace all the timber sleepers in the railway, under the railway lines around the country. So they're called TRSs, timber replacement sleepers, even though they're concrete. A very interesting project. So just to sort of get to a point where we're starting to ask some questions, this interesting project, I mentioned optimised replacement cost before. So this particular project was valuing a hole in the ground, believe it or not. So, and it's a tax-driven exercise. So, if we look at the red line, that red line is actually what was there, and that yellow line from this point is actually what they needed to do. But there was a point there where that said 150 million. Cubic metres was what needed to be evaluated. So that point, that's where they were at the date of valuation. So in other words, instead of building a hole this big, the tax office said, what's the smallest hole you can dig to get to that point? Not the biggest one you've built over time, but what's the smallest hole? So that's called the optimised replacement cost. What's the lowest cost or modern equivalent asset or lowest cost alternative to actually facilitate that development? And so to do that, there's some parameters involved. So the road that actually builds that hole in the ground has to be a certain width, and that width is determined by the width of two trucks going up and down because they need to pass one another. So that's factored into the mining engineers factor that in, and then they take into account all of the physical features of what's actually there and what needs to be done. And there was an interesting scenario because this was what was called a tax review. So the tax office flagged what this company had booked as the value of that hole in the ground on acquisition, which was nearly $600 million. And they thought that's too much. We're going to review them and challenge them. And so there were a couple of, and as a result, I got asked to do a valuation. And there are a couple of case laws that I could refer to. And the first one suggested we could actually do the depreciated replacement cost. So in other words, what was that big hole in the ground, less depreciation, what was that number? And that number was 1.5 billion. Then there was the purchase price of the mine. So what did they pay for everything, including the hole? Because what's the market comparable to what they've bought? And that was 1.3 billion. What was the market value based on tax ruling 2012/7, which was the valuation of just the haul road? They actually passed legislation that said you could go and value. You could go. No, I remember this now. You could actually. Because I only do this every year, once a year, and it comes up. They actually said in that tax law that the most someone would pay would be what it would cost for somebody to duplicate that asset. So in other words, the smallest hole that required to get to that level of mining, what would that cost to replicate? And that was the 1 point. So the optimised replacement cost is 1.29. There was a court case in WA where the judge ruled he didn't know what the answer to a technical question like this was. Was it the mine was valued at 1.5 billion, so the hole in the ground was 1.5 billion, and he didn't know if it should be worth 1.5 billion or zero. So he ruled that it could be anywhere in between and took the midpoint. So, can you imagine the knock-on effects to a company when that happens? So in that scenario, we did the same thing. So under the market value, the RCF is Resource Capital Fund. Under the ruling on that case, which has been appealed, it's still actually going on. So that would suggest that the gross replacement cost, the big hole to replace, would be 1.6, 1.726 billion, and that's the midpoint of that. And then we have the market value of the optimised depreciated replacement cost. So that optimised replacement cost, which is that one, less depreciation equals that one. And they're still north of this, it was 545 million that we valued them on, that hole in the ground, the pit, as they call it, we valued the pit for. So I did not conclude a value. I actually said, scenario 1, it's worth this, scenario 2, 3 and 4. And basically the client put it to the tax office and said, if we were to pursue this, these are the, depending on which method we would use, here are our results. And so they actually dropped the case. They stopped pursuing them. And the client was wrapped, as you can imagine. I also mentioned before valuing livestock ships around the world, that's probably another interesting project. I had a great delight doing so. Some of these ships were, that one on the top right was in Fremantle, so that was the first one I valued. And the one at the bottom right was in the Gulf of Aqaba, out near Aqaba, so that was interesting place to get to, as you can imagine. The other one, what's called the Gena, the G-E-H-E-N-A, I think from memory that one was anchored, it was sitting in Singapore at the port for 4 days, and we were trying to get all the paperwork done so I could get on board the ship. It was rather, and it was costing them $20,000 a day to have it sit there in the port of Singapore. So they went and put it in what's called the anchorage in the South China. I think that's what they call it, anchorage in the South China Sea. I should put a slide up because there's a thing like when you're getting an Uber and you see the car. There's a thing for aeroplanes, flight 20, radar 24, where you can see all the aeroplanes flying around. There's a thing called marine data, and you can actually see all the ships. And it looks like it's amazing how many there are. And I had to go through all these thousands of ships to get there, and it took 6 hours to get there and 6 hours back. And so when I got there, whenever you go on board a ship, it's quite formal, and you meet the captain, and there's hellos, and I always say that my standard line is, "Hello, Captain. I'm always in awe and admiration of anyone who can legally marry me and shoot me." So he can do that, no questions asked. So and then they want to have lunch, and so you have lunch, and then you walk around. So it's 4 hours on board the ship, and then back for 6 hours. And I got back to Singapore at the cruise terminal at midnight, and coming up, and there's like 6 customs officials, and I'm on my own walking through the terminal, and I thought, oh no, this is not going to look good. And so one came over and said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Yeah, I'm just coming back." And I said, "Where have you come from?" And I said, "Singapore." And they said, "You're in Singapore?" I said, "I know, I was here this morning, but I've been away and I've come back." And they said, "Are you working in Singapore?" And then I thought, oh, this is going down that rabbit hole. I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole or not. And then anyway, so she said, "Come with me." And I had to sit down in front of the boss and like I'm on board a patrol in the corner. And the guy said, "You're just doing a survey on the boat, aren't you?" I went, "Yeah," and he saw him stamp, off you go. So it was all right, but it was rather touch and go for a while. And this one was in, I remember this one, this was in a place called Mersin. And if you've ever been to Turkey, Mersin's in the very western part of Turkey. In fact, can't remember the name of the airport that we flew into, might have been, but the next stop is Syria. So when you go on, you see the maps, there's like a red dotted line on Google Maps and red lines like this. It says Syria and don't go there, and I'm at the closest airport to it. So that was at night. That was rather interesting. So that was a very interesting project. And these ships, they start off as $20 million second-hand oil tankers or container ships, and then they spend about $80 million converting them to livestock ships. And a lot of people have different views on whether we or the world should export live exports. But Australia is one of the best countries in the world that does it. We have what's called the AMSA standard, and on board they have ventilation systems, water production systems, feed systems, and wastewater and management systems, etc., etc. So there's an Irish standard, which is one of everything. which is around the world. In Australia, we have the Australian or the AMSA system, which is 2 of everything. So the ships that they actually end up getting to their destination fatter and better condition than when they got on board. So, and that's a lot of people don't hear that side of that industry. But that was a PwC job. A Dubai company bought these assets from a Jordanian company, so it was rather interesting personnel involved, as you can imagine. This was a very interesting project. I got to value 3 of these things. These are called pipe laying barges, so pipes that get used in the oil industry mostly get laid around the world, and then when they're not getting laid around the world, they're getting maintained by these vessels and other vessels. And inside that infrastructure, there's a whole stack of pipes that actually get heated up and joined, and then lowered into the water as the thing gets towed along. They have various values, but those sort of projects are drying up, so the value of these vessels are being compromised. And there was a dispute regarding the value of 3 of these things. So I was an expert in there was a Leighton's Contractors, who's an Australian company, and a US bank, and the arbitration was in London. So I had to go with all the lawyers to London and go and appear as an expert. So, and the first question I get asked was, "Hello, Mr. Van Ray, how are you?" "Very good, thank you." And he said, "Are you aware that we have worked together before in the past?" And I had no clue who he was. And I said, "Have we?" And he said, "Yes, you're our expert on a case involving, 5 years earlier, but there was a conflict because of a merger, blah, 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 and you had to hand it over to somebody else." And I don't know why he did it, but we were speculating that perhaps he wanted to say it, to acknowledge it first before I brought it up, to say, well, I can't be that bad if you've used me in the past, as in part of my defending myself. We think that may have been the reason. But then the guy who got on the other side, the other valuer, he got grilled for 4 hours all morning from 9 till 1. And then at 2 o'clock I went in and he started with that. And he said, "What are all these notes in front of you?" And I said, "Well, I've written notes to the questions that Captain Mead was asked this morning. So if I get asked the same question, I can respond quickly and save everybody time." And he said, "You won't need any of those." He made me push all those aside. And then he said, "What did you get paid to do this valuation?" And I said, $20,000 per vessel. And he said, "What's that in pounds?" And he's making a song and dance about it. And someone said £8,000. He said, "What about in US dollars?" And someone said, 10,000. He made this grand song and dance about the fee. And he said, "Do you think if Captain Mead," because I know what he charged $1,000 per vessel. I charged $10,000 per vessel. And he said, "Do you think if Captain Mead had the same financial resources as you, that he would have a very different result to the one that he got?" To which I then said, "I believe you should ask that question to Captain Mead." So he's asked me a question about somebody I don't know anything about. So, and it got him in the... And then he said, every question he asked, I actually said the opposite answer to what he was expecting. He said, "This ship was valued for $100 million in January. You've put $20 million on it in September. Is that..." what was the word he used? "Incomprehensible," or something like that. And I said, "Absolutely." And as he's walking away, I said, "Absolutely not." And he stopped and he turned and he said, "Why is that?" And I told him about a small thing called the GFC, and that there were ships worth hundreds of millions of dollars at anchor that were worth next to nothing, waiting for instructions, waiting to be scrapped, waiting for the world to change. And these were right in the middle of all of that, and that's why their values dropped so much. In fact, the other company who valued them at $50 million couldn't sell them for 20, yet they valued them at 50. So it was really, very interesting. I was out in 45 minutes. So I had business class flights to London, a really nice hotel for 3 days. I ended up going to Frankfurt and Vienna to call in and see people I knew, and I flew home, and I was of presenting or appearing for 45 minutes, and that was it. And saved the client quite a lot of money because the process was when they couldn't agree that they got valuations, and then they couldn't agree on the valuations. And so my job was to actually debunk one of the valuations, because all the valuations they had were $20 or $30 million, but this one was way out there at 100. And the lease stipulated that it would be an average of all the valuations. So we were trying to get rid of this one because it killed the average. So that's what that was all about. So a really interesting project. One of my greatest joys was probably valuing the Eurostar. So actually going and valuing all the trains in France. I went there quite a lot in 1998 to 2006 to value different train sets. So each train is 10 carriage, 2 locos and 8 carriages long. They're worth about $180 million each for the set. And one of the big issues with this one is modelling the life of the train. So every 18 years they would go through a major refurb, which would then extend the life, So on that basis you would think 18, the life is 54 years. But the industry was only saying trains have a life of 50 years. So we had to prove to a lot of people in the US who are funding these why it was 54 and not 50 because of the tax laws, and they have what's called the 80-20 rule, which is 20% of the value of the asset must remain when it's 80% of its life has expired. The tax laws have changed, but that was the law at the time. And the older the asset, obviously that was easier to prove. So again, really interesting project. Valuing a cruise ship for friends in Fiji who wanted to make the entrepreneurship, as I mentioned before. Malaysia Airlines. So Malaysia Airlines went into receivership, or administration I should say, which you probably recall, as a result of MH17 and MH370? Yep. And so PwC was the administrator in KL, and I'd worked, that guy was a partner at Arthur Anderson, and he and I worked on Ansett together. So he got me up to KL and to value all of the aircraft that they own. There was about 70 of them, including A380s and a couple of 747s and a whole stack of other Airbus assets. And they're real and they had valuations, but so there was Malaysia MAS, Malaysia Airlines Systems, MAB, Malaysia Airlines Berhad, and all the assets were being transferred from one to the other, and they were going to kill off the old company and then start the new company with fresh values and start afresh. But the CEO said, I'm not paying that amount of money for those assets at book value to transfer them over, or at valuation, because the valuers were instructed, what's the value of that plane? So they would value that. I think it's a, doesn't really matter, but the one above it's an A380. So if you were to value one asset, you can go to guidelines and say, an Airbus or a Boeing 737 or A350 or A330 or A320, it's so many years old, etc., like you do in a car, and you can go, it should be worth between $67 and $75 million. And so that's the value that they were putting on those assets. But because there was virtually a takeover, if you like, they were acquiring these assets. So the instructions were not, what's the market value of that asset and that asset and that asset, if you're assuming, because those values assume proper marketing. Proper marketing for an aircraft could be anywhere between 2 to 4 years. They assume that all their information is recorded accurately, so all the books and logbooks are up to date, all the directives by the aviation authorities have been followed, there's a complement of spares supporting them, etc., etc. So the instructions were clear to the valuers, which was, what's the value of the fleet on this day, selling it to one purchaser, and it's got to be wound up, it's going to be done on Saturday. So you've got one purchaser. You're not breaking it up. You're going to have an auction, and it's for everything. You're not breaking it up. So all of a sudden, your 50 potential customers is narrowed down to one. And what would they pay? So, and it's government-backed customer. So if this fleet was operating profitably, they had advanced reservations and payments in the system, they had cash in the bank, they had forward freight orders, they had holidays wrapped up for people to go on. The aircraft were all up to date with their maintenance, there's no big surprises in costs. So in other words, as a vendor, you would want to sell a business with those types of assets. You would want more than the sum of the individual parts to break it up. You want something for your effort that it's all intact, and they're going to start earning revenue day one. You would want Market Plus for that.
Is that goodwill?
There's a bit of goodwill, but generally speaking, it's a more optimistic view of the assets rather than goodwill. But everything I've just said was the opposite was true. So the records weren't good. The market was tanking. There's only a custom one. You don't have 2 to 4 years. You have a week or a month, etc., etc. So as a single purchaser, would have to enter into a mindset of what discount would I apply, and that was the argument I had to have with the Malaysian government. While I'm standing out in front of a pub on the mobile phone, about to go into a fundraiser lunch, and say to them and explain this to on a conference call to say no, this is a discount to the market value, not a premium, and these are the reasons why. And it was a huge discount. So the A380, for example, it was a real interesting one because when they were brand new, they were $250 million each. There's only so many airlines around the world that can actually fit them in their airports. So many airports that they can fit at the gates. There's only so many airlines that can actually manage them. And you know Malaysia, Singapore, Emirates, etc., Qantas, etc. So the orders stopped. The orders stopped for these aircraft, and they reduced the price at the manufacturing level to try and move them, and they dropped them down to about 130 million, from 250 to 130. So what does that mean? A market value of an A380 is a 10-year-old one. So we ended up putting something like $98 million on it, and we were told, the grief was unbearable, and the discussions were quite heated. But the months that ensued, the reported prices just kept coming down, and now, even though they're only 13 or 14 years old, the oldest ones, they're being scrapped already because they can't sell them. So because of the new technology as well, the Dreamliners and the A350s that are around are far more economic on a $1 per passenger operating cost per mile.
So none of them sold?
Sorry, they all sold to MAB, right, but at a reduced price. Oh. So the loss was carried by the government over here, but the benefit was achieved over there. So they sold them to themselves in effect. Right. But that argument between old company and new company was a rather interesting one. So they were lucky, really, because they've set up a business now with a low cost base for their assets, and they can actually, I haven't checked, but I'm assuming they're making a profit. So a very, really interesting project. This was another interesting project. You probably see, and you're sick of them like I am, and these getaway, if Katrina Roundtree's on one of these boats, or somebody's on one of these boats on the weekend on TV, it's every weekend. So one of these boats is Scenic Tours. They advertise everywhere, but these river cruise vessels are really dominating the shipping market in Europe. Australia actually dominates this segment in Europe, believe it or not. So Scenic Tours and APT are two of the largest companies that actually do this in Europe. And my first project with them was in 2007, and there was a subsequent one 7 years later. But you can see there on the bottom left-hand side, both of these are in the shipyards. And that's the owner there, Glenn Moroney. But we went over to Amsterdam and to Germany to look at the shipyards where they were being built, and I had to value 10 of these ships that were being built, and that's what they look like. They're called the spaceships, but they've got a new series now. So, you'll see on TV. A job involving some trains, a job involving some buses, a family law matter involving this is a country earth-moving business owned by two brothers that hated each other's guts. And it happens. They even lived together. They lived side by side at the end of a court in a town in country Victoria, and their kids all went to the same school, and they were fighting. And a very interesting scenario to walk in on, but and do valuations. Very interesting. But it's funny when you get situations like that, and you've got to be very diplomatic, of course, in those examples. This one, I was an expert witness on this vessel, the HMAS Bundaberg. The maintenance contractors actually set fire to it. and it sank during when they were putting the fire out. So it was a large court case and legal matter involving that. Insurance. The insurance company wouldn't pay because the company that was actually doing the maintenance just paid the bank, because the Commonwealth Bank actually owned them, because they paid for the construction of them, and they leased them back to the government. The government had a maintenance contract on them, and so on and so forth. It's rather complicated, but they just paid. They assumed that their insurance company was going to pay them out because they paid $30 million for a new ship, and the insurance company said, "We don't believe it's worth $30 million. We only think it's worth whatever it was."
Was that accident? Not on purpose.
Accidentally on purpose? No, it was an accident because they really need those ships. So there's heaps more been ordered since. So this was a really interesting one. So a formaldehyde plant in Victoria had a group of shareholders. One was sick of losing money, so he wanted out. So the other shareholders said, "Well, what do you want to be paid out?" And he said, "Well, I owe the bank $750,000, so they paid him $750,000. So by default, that raised the stamp duty effect because they bought him out. There was an acquisition. So the stamp duty's office engaged the Valuer General, and the Valuer General engaged a plant equipment valuer from New South Wales. This is in Victoria. And they came down and said the thing's worth $16 million. But we talked about economic obsolescence before. This company was going broke. They had what was called a power purchase contract, a power purchase agreement, a PPA. And that meant they had to, for the next foreseeable, well, for the length of the contract, buy power off the power company, whether they used it or not. And to minimise their losses, they thought, well, we might as well keep trading, even though we're running at a loss, to minimise our losses rather than pay the maximum loss by paying out this contract. So when the valuer came down from Sydney and looked at it, he saw a working plant. And he naturally assumed, he valued it on the assumption that it was profitable and said it was worth $16 million. So then we went and asked the company, "Can you sell it?" And they said, "We've been trying to sell it for years." We then asked a property valuer, "What's the value of the land unencumbered if it was cleared and you could sell the land?" And they said $4 million, assuming all that contamination was, just ignore that for a minute. And then we said, "What would it cost to dismantle this plant?" And they said $6 million. So I said, "It's going to cost $6 million to access the land underneath worth $4 million." They said, "Yes." So we put a value of that on it. So zero. So it went from $16 million at 5%, a big chunk of change, down to $0 at 5%. So the client was pretty happy. But it was, I just couldn't believe that there was ignored, all the inputs to the valuation were ignored. This is a power station in the middle of, well, it's in Port Hedland in Western Australia. That's where I was 12 months ago. I'm actually valuing a plant at the same company, Alinta, at Newman. I was there a few weeks ago. Almost identical. And just one slide, I think we're almost there, Howard. So just one more slide to finish up with. So we're all come from different walks of life, and I just wanted to add this one slide, which is, you know, we're all busy, but in our careers, but I just want you to understand the value of networking. So never, ever underestimate it. I know we're doing a lot of things online, and we know, even my job, I can sit in my office and just not talk to anybody. I can research everything online, I can call people, I don't have to talk to anybody. But I can do that because I've had 35 years face-to-face doing that out in the marketplace. So value your networks and value your relationships. It's vital to survive going forward in whatever career you're choosing as it becomes more virtual, more remote and more automated. So the person next to you could be your greatest client in the future. So don't ignore them. So there are large businesses actually have programs where the junior management groups, they actually try and get them to talk to each other, because they'll leave and they might be the CFO or CEO of a company that might be a target of you and your firm or your company down the track. So actually start building and working your relationships and start to network. And get to know one another. So the big issue about mental health, you know, it can't be cured online. So you need to talk to people and check in with your friends and family and colleagues and be good and be kind. I actually wrote, "Don't be a dick," but I put it but I actually scrubbed it out and put "be kind," because I don't know where this might go. So don't be a dick, but be kind. and look out for one another. And I hope you've had a pretty good insight into what plant machinery valuations are. You probably all wanted my job, which is, I didn't know what I was getting into when I was in high school. I got a book, it was 101 jobs for school leavers, and right after, under V, right before veterinarian was valuer. And there was the valuer had a Range Rover, and he was sitting on the hood with a foot on the fence overlooking a farm with a lamb's wool jacket on out in the country. And he said, if you like working in an office and going out in the field, then a valuer is the right job for you. And that was it. I just looked for a job as a valuer when I was 17 and got it, and I've been in it ever since. So I could have been a vet. So I wish you well in your careers, whichever way it's going, and feel free to link in on LinkedIn if you wish, and I'll be more than happy to help you out, make introductions for you. Last year's presentation, I got a couple of LinkedIn invites and a couple of coffee meetings after to provide some advice, and it's really nice to see people, help people find careers at work in the valuation sphere or the property sphere in general. So be more than happy to help out. So thank you very much. Any questions?
It seems you value so many plant and machinery. I just thought it was factories and such, but you do such a wide breadth of subjects. If you get a call to value something you've never valued before, how do you sort of, because you need to know the ins and outs of the business, how do you read up or?
Well, I have been doing this for a long time, so there's not many things I haven't valued before. So that's the first thing. So I know it sounds flippant, but it's probably true. But it's a valuer who's older than me was an expert in a court case in London, and he was asked. He had to value a particular crane. It was one of a kind. It was the only one of its type in the world, and it was unique. So how can you have experience valuing something like that? So in his cross-examination, he was asked, what other credentials do you bring to the table in valuing something like this? And he said, I valued this underwater ship welding business in the north coast of Ireland. And it was totally irrelevant. And the barrister said, well, how is that relevant? He says, it's unique, it's one of a kind, it's the only one of its type in the world. And he gave 3 or 4 more examples like that. So the same principles apply, cost, market, income. So whether you're valuing a computer, so can you, it has a cost, less depreciation, there's a market, that's a market value using the cost approach. We can sell it second-hand on eBay, there's a market approach. I can rent it and get a rental income from it, there's an income approach. So whether it's a computer or retail space or commercial office space or a factory, or specialised things like pipelines or specialised shipping assets, or you actually take the very same approach on everything.
So you mentioned you were at PwC before. How did you actually get into plant? Did you start as a property developer, like industrial or something? Or?
So when I was in year 12 at Whitefriars College, I don't know if you know Whitefriars out in Donvale, but I saw a job in the newspaper and it said under T for trainee plant and machinery valuer must have HSC, high school certificate, so qualified for year 12, must be 18 to 25 and have your driver's licence. Good opportunity for travel. That's all it said. I was 17, I wasn't 18 to 25, I was still in school and I was too young to drive. So I met none of the 3 things they asked for, but I sent an application off on the Monday and in a courier bag, because there was a postal strike on at Christmas time, this time of year, in 1981, I think. And I got a reply from the company in Sydney the next day, and they said, we've got your application. I said, have you? Really? Like, typical year 12 student. And they said, the boss will be down tomorrow in Melbourne, can you meet with him? So Mum had to buy me clothes and everything else, and I had this interview, and I got the job, so I could start on the 4th of January, and this was like October or November, and they said I could start on the 4th of January. So I went on my year 12 break knowing I had a job on the 4th of January to go to. And that's how I got in it and stayed in it ever since. But nowadays it's a bit more And there was no uni courses or anything, so I'm pure valuation. I haven't come from engineering, I haven't come from accounting, I've been pure valuation. And that's rare these days in my field. Most of them come from engineering or accounting and finance and come across from that finance angle or the technical angle. And there is training now that the American Society of Appraisers offers in Australia to get qualified. And that's all been revamped at the moment, but you can get qualified in Australia. So that's how I got in it. Very rare. But after I read that book and didn't become a vet. Anything else? No, all good? All silent? Going once? One more!
What do you think the trickiest thing that you value?
The trickiest thing?
In terms of you've had the most trouble with?
Probably a container full of bull semen. That's probably the trickiest thing, because I had no idea. I was valuing a stud farm, and it was a matrimonial thing, and the things that they were giving me were weird, and I had no idea. Of a more traditional, funny that's the first thing that popped into my head. Amusement parks, they're tricky. So you may recall the Dreamworld ride that killed those people a few years ago. That used to be at an amusement park in Sydney, and I valued it when it was in Sydney. And so valuing that, I actually got to sit in the engineer's office and next to a filing cabinet, and I was looking at the files for each ride. So you pull out the file and open it up, boom, and there from the manufacturer is a list of all the incidents around the world that have happened on each ride, and what caused it, and what they should do to remedy it, and what to watch out for in the future, and all those things. So I'm looking at every ride had a file like this. The dinkiest little kiddie ride where kids have been killed in the US or Asia or Europe, and I'm reading about it here, and I'm thinking, I would never put my kids on any of these rides. So getting that sort of behind the scenes thing, and there was a thing called the Tower, the Big Drop, I think it was, 200 feet, you go up, and then it lets you go and you free fall, and then you stop with an electric magnetic brake. And so I'm out the back, looking at this standby diesel generator, and I'm thinking to myself, what if the power goes off? What if the power goes off and you're going... And there was this little battery charger about that big, and these wires all exposed, and I said, what happens if the power goes off? They said, oh, well, this will kick in and everything. And I'm thinking, there's no way knowing it's going to stop this ride, kicking in time. And I went on it, and I found this out afterwards, and I've never been on it ever since. So, again, there's a heap of things I could share with you, but there too that come to mind. Eurostars are good. In France, they were just fantastic. The RAT, driverless subway cars in Paris, ferries in Sweden, the ferries in New Zealand between the North and South Island. I do those every now and again. Just heaps of stuff. Really good.
How long does a typical project take? Like, how long does it take?
That really depends. Like I said, the 100 mines in 20 countries took 20 people over a year, so it was well over $1 million fee. Some normally take a couple of days. I did one project, and then the guy said, do I value number plates? And I said, oh, what do you mean? He said, I've got this number plate, it's in a dispute, I bought it from on eBay, Big Rose contacted me, I shouldn't have, the woman who sold it was part of a matrimonial dispute, and I had to give it back, and I want to be compensated. I said, you need to get it valued. So, do you value number plates? I said, I have never valued a number plate, but I'm into cars, and I've actually got a couple, so I know what they're worth. And so it was a little $500 job, and a love job for a couple of hours. So, I'll do something as little as that, but others that can take months. But generally a couple of weeks. Most take a couple of weeks. I don't get out of bed for less than 10 grand, is that what they say? So. Any more questions? Very good. Thank you.
Fascinating stories.
There you are. Bottle of wine. Oh, very good. Thank you. I can put it in here. That's right. Hello. Hi, how are you?
Okay, so we probably have 5 minutes break. Come back. We spend 15 minutes or 20 minutes to talk about Simon Fu. So do stay. Now the information is on the subject of the talk. So everyone's doing the same. Everyone's doing shopping what's it called? Yeah, so yeah, I'm going to go through some details. It's pretty much like on the subject outline. Right, 72 that's the package.
Oh, I saw that. So this is the brochure.
Yeah, so it's even
that was an example.
Yeah, and then it's
okay.
No, that's the retail respect.
Tennis issue tells you who your anchors are, all these sort of things, and then your sales evidence gives you some of these sort of scorecards.
It was sold back in 2017.
Yeah.
So it's assuming some features
So with this evidence, your sales evidence, that's what we do a discounted catalogue with or something.
But you make a choice. But I have to tell you, the sales evidence, examples, considering the age. So it's 2017, 18. So it's doing research.
Okay, see if it goes upwards.
Find some of our own sales evidence.
Yeah, so
Okay. Latest.
try to search.
From like anchors, like balance statements, key anchors, those sort of things,
So you basically do sales, and also went to evidence. You normally get evidence from existing tenants, some market rents, estimated by the same try to make it as realistic as possible. But the tenant schedule information is modified anyway, so the result is not market anyway. So it's sales value. That is based on realistic.
Just last 5 years. We've got lots of places in our students that also. I come home with sort of grades and I'm bang on the fridge, but the fridge was covered from those places. She's in Europe now, and I found out on social media. She's in the Charlie Queen, or it's just her. Let's go. She's got the furthest. I've never been and I'll leave you to it. I'll go and finish fanning my power station.
Grab that for you.
Oh, exactly. She likes it. You're doing very good work. See you, Hal. Good to see you again. See you, Alexander. All the best. Thank you. I'll go. No worries.